Mass unrest in Sri Lanka as the economy spirals out of control. With food and fuel in short supply, demonstrators demand the president step down. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The word crisis is often overused, but when it comes to Sri Lanka, it might not go far enough. The island nation is in the midst of its worst economic downturn since gaining independence more than 70 years ago. Food and fuel are in short supply, and millions wait in line for hours for most basic goods. Frequent power cuts are forcing shops to shut down, and Sri Lankans have had enough. Simmering tensions finally boiled over to spark violent protests. The government declared a state of emergency and introduced a curfew. Security forces are accused of using excessive force to end the unrest, but Sri Lankans have carried on.
They have used batons and tear gas to suppress the protests. We would like to remind those in the government that if you think you can suppress us, you're all mistaken. The progress we have made cannot be taken back.
But while protesters are defiant, so too is the president. Despite the economic collapse and nearly all his ministers resigning, Rajapaksa says he has no intention of stepping down. Let's take a closer look at the man behind the turmoil in Sri Lanka. Gotabaya Rajapaksa joined the Sri Lankan army in 1971, serving for more than 20 years. After retiring from the military, he moved to the United States, where he lived for nearly a decade. Rajapaksa returned to Sri Lanka in 2005 after his older brother Mahinda became president and appointed him Secretary of Defense. Gotabaya played an instrumental role in ending Sri Lanka's 3-decade-long civil war. But some say his brutal tactics in that conflict that killed nearly 40,000 civilians amount to war crimes. But in 2019, a few months after Sri Lanka's Easter Sunday bombings, the Buddhist nationalist won the presidential election in a landslide. Many said his Islamophobic rhetoric raised religious tensions and polarized the country. But support for Rajapaksa, much like the economy, has been in sharp decline. The president has tried to appease demonstrators, even firing his own brother as finance minister, though his replacement, Ali Sabri, quit after just one day on the job. Sri Lanka's struggling economy is at the heart of people's anger, and they clearly have no doubt as to where the blame lies.
So we are here on behalf of Sri Lanka, the entire nation. So we are facing so many crises. We have no money, people are struggling, people have no food, people have nothing, people have no gas to cook, people have no money to buy food. So this has to stop. Something has to change in this country. So we are here to make that change, and we will fight until this thing changes. Gotabaya has to go home.
So let's get some perspective now from inside the government. And joining me from Colombo is Shanakiyan Rasamanickam. He is a member of parliament from the opposition ITAK party. We did invite representatives from President Rajapaksa's party, but they were unable to join us. Thank you so much for being with us, Shanakiyan. I realize you are extremely busy right now, and you actually ran out to your car to do this interview with us, so we greatly appreciate it. Tell us, though, how it feels right now to be part of the government, and was it shocking to see, the public rise up like this, so united against Rajapaksa's leadership?
Thank you, Andrea, for having me on the show. In fact, as an opposition member of parliament, and the most opposition political parties predicted this situation almost a year and a half ago, that this was going to happen, that this was inevitable, because our foreign debt was so high, and our foreign reserves are depleting due to no revenue earned through tourism because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Easter Sunday attacks the year before. However, the government refused to listen to the opposition MPs and refused to restructure our debt. Whilst we were blocked out of capital market access to further financing, the government just decided to go ahead and deplete all the foreign reserves that were on hand. And this naturally led to shortages of fuel, and we have power cuts, power outages of nearly 13 hours a day, no access to milk powder, and also President Rajapaksa went ahead with a ridiculous ban on fertilizer imports and chemicals. And now that's going to lead to a food crisis because our harvest from agriculture has reduced by 60-70%. So people have now finally have said enough is enough and have taken to the streets and are demanding that President Rajapaksa resigns immediately.
Right.
But President.
But let me ask you, though, I mean, you've clearly identified what you believe went wrong. So if President Rajapaksa steps down now, I mean, how much would actually be solved?
Well, the problem is that the opposition parties and major alliance partners of President Rajapaksa's government do not want to join an interim government whilst President Rajapaksa and his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa are still heading the government. So people don't want to be part. People don't want them to be part of any solution going forward because they're the reason for all this destruction. So they don't want President Rajapaksa to be chairing any of the meetings where decisions are being made because people have naturally lost faith in them altogether. So if President Rajapaksa resigns now, all the opposition parties and some government parties are willing to come together to form a transitional government that could take us out of this crisis. Still, we have elections in the future because elections right now is not a possibility because that's not what people want. What we need right now is to resolve this crisis so that people can go back to their lives and people don't have to protest. And President Rajapaksa even went to the extreme of calling a state of emergency. And when Mr. Sumandiran, political MP from my political party, demanded that a vote be taken to ensure that the emergency bill is passed in Parliament, President decided to withdraw the bill because clearly they're worried that they might not have majority in Parliament. So going forward, I think without President Rajapaksa resigning, this public uprising is not going to stop. They even call it the Arab Spring
if he
of Sri
doesn't
Lanka.
resign, though, are you looking at a no confidence vote? Would that at least move toward, restructuring the government and going forward? Is that what's in the cards?
Well, there are a lot of discussions. There are a lot of discussions happening right now. So I think right now people want President to resign. If President doesn't resign, then that will have to be the other measures would have to be seen. But even in Parliament, the government is now trying to tell the people that Parliament is useless. The government is trying to project the Parliament as a useless thing, and that if rather than President resigning, the government is trying to say Parliament is also responsible for all of this. So if President doesn't resign and Parliament is removed, and then that paves way for a military rule. And President Rajapaksa, being a military man, he has a military background and has very close links to the military. Maybe the president wants these civil unrest or the civil protests to continue so that he can call in the military to take over the country, and democracy will pay the price in this country. So we are very cautious about that as well, and we are trying to tell the people. True, we do understand that there are certain members of Parliament in today's Parliament who are not fit to be parliamentarians, but unfortunately, the ruling party, which had 2/3 majority in Parliament, gave nominations to murderers, drug traffickers, people who are into illegal mining, people who are not fit to be MPs were given nominations, and then people had to choose the best crook out of the crooks. And therefore, Parliament's quality of the Parliament has come down, which is, I agree with that too. But Parliament needs to be strengthened. And one more thing is that President Rajapaksa, as soon as he came into power, passed the 20th Amendment to the Constitution and took away most amount of powers that were within the Parliament to himself, the executive, thereby making Parliament less powerful. So we need to, if President Rajapaksa doesn't resign, we need to find a way to make him resign or impeach him, move a motion against him. Impeaching him is an option. And then from there onwards, maybe bring a new amendment to the Constitution, the 21st Amendment, maybe to reinstate powers back to Parliament. But right now, what's important is that the people need to come out of this crisis. People should stop suffering. So all these things that we talk about could take time, but right now we need something that can be done immediately.
Shanakiyan, Rasamanickam, thank you so much for joining us there from Colombo. So let's broaden out the discussion now and get some perspective from outside the government. Joining me from Colombo is Shamara Wettimuny, a historian and researcher at Oxford University. Anushka Wijisinha is an economist and co-founder of the Center for a Smart Future. And also from Colombo is human rights activist Ruki Fernando, thanks also much for being with us. Ruki, I'm going to start with you because you have actively been participating in the protests. So tell me first what brought you onto the streets and what's kept you out there, even after police started cracking down.
Like many people, I think my house is also in darkness right now. I have no electricity, so I had to find some alternative ways of lighting up. I don't have Wi-Fi, and I had to make sure my phone was charged in time. But there are much more serious inconveniences than those. Like I had also no gas at home to cook, and there was no fuel for vehicles. And like many others, I was also badly affected. So it was natural for me to join. It was not just about me and my family, but also about everyone else. And I joined, I think, this stream of protest from the beginning of March, long before the police crackdowns and long before tens of thousands started to gather. Of course, now it has escalated because the crisis has escalated and the crisis is not showing any signs of being resolved. So more and more people, many more people are getting angry, desperate, and joining in.
Okay, let me turn to Shamara. I mean, obviously the circumstances are difficult. Fuel shortages, food shortages, all the common problems when an economy crashes the way it has in Sri Lanka. But do you believe the government really is solely to blame? Or has the government, in a sense, been a victim as well of very difficult global circumstances?
That's a really interesting question because under normal circumstances, you could say, yes, of course, external factors affect the economic crisis, and I'm sure Anush can speak more about that. But there is a deeper structural issue here where you actually can pinpoint blame at the government. You see, when this government came into power in 2019, and then in the presidential election followed by another mandate in the general elections of 2020, they passed an amendment to the Constitution, the 20th Amendment of the Constitution, which concentrated power within the executive presidency. It centralized power to the point where we lost checks and balances on the executive. So if there was anyone who could have taken decisions, passed policies to make a difference, to nip it in the bud, it was the president and his brother, the prime minister. They have had more power than any government or leader in Sri Lanka's modern history. And that callous failure to do so is why, alongside calls on the streets for the government for the president and his brother to resign, is also a demand to abolish the executive presidency. And yesterday in Parliament, the opposition leader also agreed that that there should be an amendment introduced to abolish the executive presidency. So we have to wait and see whether such progress will happen.
Okay. So Shamara introduced some of the likely culprits in this crisis now and what the government had done. But Anushka, many say that the core issue in the economy here was a failure, a refusal really, for Rajapaksa's government to accept some assistance from the IMF and negotiate when it could have. And now there are supposed to be talks, if I'm not mistaken, later this month with the IMF, when these talks could have been conducted plenty of time before this crisis really hit its depths. What do you think?
Absolutely, and I think the economic mismanagement started when the government decided quite irresponsibly to slash taxes in a way that severely affected Sri Lanka's revenue on an already thin revenue base, and that eroded Sri Lanka's fiscal position. It was not seen favorably by international ratings agencies, and consequently, Sri Lanka was locked out of international capital markets. Why that was important was because we had a series of debt repayments coming due, and for that, Sri Lanka needed to go back to the international capital markets, and effectively, we were then shut out. Since then, there was a series of cascading policy errors that weakened the economy, affected macroeconomic stability, and frankly, there was a sense of false bravado that so-called homegrown solutions could be adopted and we can get out of this crisis. There was over-optimism about the role that tourism recovery, recovery in remittances, a recovery in exports, a recovery in FDI. There was overemphasis on the potential for that recovery to deliver the results. And given the pandemic and external shocks that followed, clearly there was complete economic mismanagement.
Okay.
So yes, there was opportunity to go to the IMF even before, during the height of the pandemic, like many other countries, and probably eke out a milder deal and nip it in the bud. But those opportunities were also ignored, and we are where we are now, where it's probably the most unprecedented economic crisis in recent decades.
Indeed. And just quickly, Anushka, I mean, will these potential negotiations with the IMF going forward, how far could they go to really solve the economic problems in Sri Lanka?
So the structural problems in the Sri Lankan economy will take longer, but right now the need for securing an agreement with the IMF and using that as the basis for restructuring Sri Lanka's debt, that is what we are looking at right now. So to me, this IMF agreement will be the first important but baby steps towards a larger reform and restructure to solve some of the structural issues that have hurt Sri Lanka. But right now we have to stay focused on averting a sovereign debt default, and responsibly moving towards a sovereign debt restructure. And the first step is getting this IMF agreement and coming up with a fiscal adjustment and macro stabilization plan.
Okay. Ruki, if we look back at the streets, I mean, is there a silver lining of sorts here? I mean, is it a good thing for Sri Lankans, for as difficult as times are right now, to see people so united like this after years of division, often along religious lines, to see them all come together with a common purpose on the streets of the country?
Yes, while the situation is quite scary and there's a lot of uncertainties about what we might descend into, not just economically, but even in terms of our democracy, whether we might become a military state. So there are all these fears, but it has been very inspiring. It has been very heartening to see that so many people as citizens take their responsibilities seriously and come out to the streets, but not just in the streets, but even in social media and through other ways express themselves about what they really need. I wouldn't really say that there's absolute unity. There are, I think, short-term grievances that are being articulated mostly by middle-class people around cities about gas, about fuel, about electricity. But there are also many other crises about people have been protesting about losing land to military and private companies, about families have disappeared who have been protesting for many, many years. So there are deep-rooted problems as well that are there. So I wouldn't say there is total unity, but it's very heartening and inspiring to see so many people taking a stand and taking a position. Particularly, it's heartening to see many young people taking positions on things that matter to themselves personally, but also to everyone in the country.
Heartening and inspiring is nice to hear, but Shamara, let me come back to you, because we also heard Ruki allude there to the potential, and we heard this mentioned in the interview prior with the opposition member of parliament there, the potential for a return to a military rule. How much does that frighten you, just the mention of it, and to know that it could be a possibility, knowing the President Rajapaksa's history in particular?
That would be extremely frightening, given that Sri Lanka can proudly boast of a post-independence history of democratic transitions. We don't have a history of military rule when you compare to certain places in the region. And I think we need to be very careful for calling for, the military, for anyone saying to do away with all 225 MPs, for instance, because we need to think about what would replace them. And in that sense, the military rule is something we certainly would not want to see. Now, for instance, yesterday at one of the protests, unidentified men turned up on motorbikes who appear to have been associated with the military. We cannot confirm this, but this is the video footage that's going around, and they seem to intimidate the protesters who were there. Now, an independent inquiry ought to be undertaken to investigate this, because this would be a serious shift away from the current democratic moment. And that should be prevented at all costs.
Right. I mean, Anushka, what is your gut kind of telling you now? Or do you fear that there could be a move, that the Rajapaksas, this dynasty of sorts, is going to dig in its heels and move toward military rule in the name of returning the country to stability? Or are you more on the lines that you think Sri Lanka will soon see a post-Rajapaksa government?
Well, if you simply look at the overwhelming calls for the end to this family's rule, individuals like the former recently resigned finance minister or the president, I mean, there are overwhelming calls for this family to be out of Sri Lankan politics. And I think that's a message that everyone can get behind. However, in terms of the trajectory moving forward, if the government, if the president is serious about Sri Lanka averting an irreversible economic catastrophe by way of a disorderly default and people going in further into distress because of all the shortages, then I think they would surely not go down a further authoritarian rule, any likelihood of militarization, because that would certainly not help our chances of getting an orderly sovereign debt restructure, a meaningful IMF program, and most importantly, bridging finance. You asked me earlier about whether the IMF program will solve anything. Frankly, it's just the start. Getting that IMF agreement will hopefully unlock other bridging finance from multilateral lenders like the World Bank and ADB, perhaps, as well as other bilaterals who could come forward to support Sri Lanka. So any hint that Sri Lanka is going down an undemocratic route will lock us out from these sources of assistance. And any individual in leadership who cares about helping Sri Lanka avert further economic catastrophe shouldn't look in any other direction but democratic steps.
Okay. I mean, Ruki, I'll finish with you then. From being out on the streets, what is your gut? What is your instinct telling you about where this government is heading?
This government is not going anywhere. It's very clear. That is why people are on the streets are demanding a big change. And the change the people are demanding is not just a change of head. It's not a reshuffling of existing people, but it's a more structural change that will ensure equality for all. And I think there's a danger in focusing too much on the IMF, because we have seen how IMF has wreaked havoc, particularly for the poor, like farmers, fisherfolk, factory workers, etc. So I think we need to also focus on the idea of equality, not just the macroeconomics, and have the human side, particularly to the marginalized and to the vulnerable. Think of things that will, in the longer term, benefit the most vulnerable and the poor, but also in the short term, ensure that there's a big focus on food and nutrition and medicine and absolute essentials like that. And that must be immediate. I think those are the things that people are thinking immediately, and that is what is expected from a more bigger political change.
Okay, Anushka, I actually have 1 minute left, so I need to ask you. I mean, Ruki was talking about sometimes the danger of relying on the IMF. We know that half of Sri Lanka's wheat and sunflower oil actually come from Ukraine and Russia. Plus you had tourism, the cheap source of income decimated by the pandemic and still struggling because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So all those factors involved, I mean, how difficult will it be to really pull the economy out of this? And could Sri Lankans actually have to prepare for further struggling, possibly even worse conditions?
I fully agree with Ruki that we have to focus on the most vulnerable in society, which is why I think I keep using this word, a sensible and meaningful IMF program, one that doesn't just set us on a macro stabilization path, but this is where the interlocutors on the government side have to be smart. We currently don't have a finance minister, so decisions around the sequencing of reforms, decisions around what will be cut, what won't be under an austerity program that is under an IMF program. I think this is what will be key. We can't do blanket cuts. We have to deprioritize certain expensive capital expenditure and reprioritize helping the most vulnerable, social protection, and making sure that we get through this crisis in a way that doesn't further scar households and businesses, but rather sets us on a
Anushka,
sensible macro stabilization
that will have to be the
path.
final word. And Shamara, I apologize for not being able to come back to you. We are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.